2 years after the launch of the PC Engine, NEC released the SuperGrafx. This console was meant to address some of the hardware issues of its predecessor, but the console only had 5 games released for it and would be a commercial failure. What happened? And why even bother releasing this thing with such a low game count? Let's take a look. What's going on? It's Podrez coming at you with another video. Alright, so if you've seen a couple of my videos and you like what I do, hit the subscribe button right there. And check out our Discord server, discord.podrez.net. I'll also put a link right in the description. Anyway, let's talk about the SuperGrafx. In the mid-80s, the two companies, Hudson Soft and NEC, joined forces and began development of their new game console. The collaboration was perfect because Hudson specialized in software while NEC specialized in hardware. NEC previously tried to sell their hardware to Nintendo, but after they disagreed, they decided to use it for themselves instead. Hudson was one of the first third-party developers, making some very early Famicom games. With two well-experienced companies on board, the PC Engine was born. Initially, things went well for NEC and Hudson. The PC Engine was more powerful than any home console that was out at the time. The Famicom would later on receive some technologically impressive games, but it relied heavily on enhancement chips to get the job done. Without mappers, the console wouldn't get anything beyond Super Mario Bros. Cartridges were only able to hold up to 32 kilobytes of ROM space. Without using chips that go inside the cartridge, the Famicom was actually not as powerful as some people might think. The PC Engine could do a lot more without any extra assistance. The HuCards could carry 2 megabytes of ROM space, which is a huge increase from the Famicom. This number would only increase with later games. The console would also support way more colors on screen. This allowed for extra shading and detail, which really makes a difference in some games. The PC Engine could also handle large sprites on screen, and many at a time. The NES would often have trouble handling multiple sprites at a time, especially games that push the hardware limits. But the PC Engine would handle multiple sprites with ease. This was especially nice with shooters, which the console had many of. But the PC Engine would have some massive flaws. Despite being advertised as 16-bit, the console had an 8-bit CPU. So it's debatable whether this console qualifies as 16-bit or not. This is especially insulting because in the US they released the console under the name TurboGrafx 16. The other issue was the lack of parallax scrolling. For those who don't know, that's when you have a background layer that moves slower than the foreground, which gives the feeling of depth in a video game. The PC Engine was not capable of this, and it made some titles look more like NES games. This problem only got worse when the Mega Drive came out only a year into the PC Engine's lifespan. That console had 2 background layers, and it really did make a difference in the graphics department. Companies tried getting around this lack of parallax scrolling by using cheap tactics. There's single-layer parallax scrolling, which gets the job done, but it limits developers on where they can put obstacles and blocks. You can also use animated tiles to give the illusion of parallax scrolling, but then you have to deal with the same tile graphics in the whole level, which isn't always a great look. And finally, you can use sprites as background graphics, which is nice because the PC Engine can handle lots of them on screen, but this can cause more flicker with the game itself. Or you could just embrace the limitations and not even try. The Mega Drive really did make the PC Engine look obsolete, and this may have been why NEC made the decision that they did. In a desperate attempt to one-up Sega, they released the SuperGrafx. This was a console that played its own line of games, although it was backwards compatible with regular PC Engine games. This console truly was 16-bit, unlike its predecessor. The SuperGrafx had 2 background layers, which NEC was so desperate to include, but that wasn't the only upgrade. The console came with 4 times as much RAM for the CPU than the PC Engine, 32 kilobytes instead of 8. It also had double the amount of video RAM, 128 kilobytes instead of 64. The SuperGrafx could also handle way more sprites on screen than the PC Engine. Could this console be the true answer to the Mega Drive? Let's take a look at a few games. First, let's try 1941 Counterattack. This is part of the 1942 series by Capcom. It's a vertical shooter that has weapon upgrades. If you hold down the fire button, you can unleash a powerful attack. You have a life bar in this game which gives you 4 hits. This is unusual because in 1943, your life bar is represented by how much fuel you have. The game has some cool segments where the screen moves horizontally, which is a nice twist on the gameplay. In some stages, you fly close to the ground, so you have to avoid nearby walls. This is an unusual obstacle for a game in the 1942 series, but it's a cool idea. The game is very lenient for a shooter. When you die, you still keep your weapon. Even if you get a game over, you still keep your score. The graphics are bright and colorful with very large sprites. We do see some nice parallax scrolling on some stages, which its predecessor would not have been able to do. However, some stages don't parallax scroll at all. I'm not sure if this was the best game to show off the SuperGrafx's capabilities, but this is still a decent title. Let's try Aldynes. We got ourselves another shooter, this time a horizontal one. You can collect weapon upgrades, and if you grab the same one multiple times, you get an upgraded version of that weapon. You can also obtain helpers that benefit you in one of two ways. You can either let the helpers move on their own and they'll zap enemies without your assistance, or you can have them follow you, which gives you extra firepower, similar to the options in Gradius. If you hold in the fire button, a force field will show up in front of your ship. This doesn't actually power up your projectiles, instead it protects you against bullets. I wish they went with the former idea. The game does show off the capabilities of the SuperGrafx way more than 1941 did. There's some nice parallax scrolling here, especially on the third stage with the cool 3D-like effect. The game can be cheap sometimes. You're completely defenseless against enemies that approach from behind. You have no way to shoot them unless you have one of the helpers. Some of the weapon upgrades are weird too, like this laser gun that doesn't shoot directly in front. The game is extremely difficult, but thankfully you have unlimited continues. This is a good game that really does show off what the SuperGrafx can do. Let's try Ghouls N Ghosts. This would become the console's best-selling game. It's a notoriously difficult platformer. You have various projectile weapons you can collect. You start off with an armor suit and you're able to take 2 hits before dying. You can collect the gold suit, which grants you a special ability, but it doesn't provide you an extra hit point. This is a well done port of the arcade game, and it does a good job recapturing all the trolley aspects. For example, sometimes you're stuck with a bad weapon, like the torch, which is terrible. This is one of the few definitive versions of Ghouls N Ghosts, the other one being the Genesis version. The graphics do look a little better in this one, but otherwise I prefer the Genesis game. That version has an options menu where you can change the difficulty. The SuperGrafx version has absolutely nothing, just the title screen. They also took away the unlimited continues, which was a feature I liked in the Genesis game. There was never a PC Engine version of Ghouls N Ghosts, so perhaps this title did entice some people to buy the SuperGrafx. However, this also means the game didn't get as much exposure as it could have. Great game, but not worth it when there's a better version of the game on a more successful console. Here's Battle Ace. It's a flight simulator that's similar to Top Gun or Afterburner. You have missiles that lock onto enemies, which is a nice feature, but you can also shoot them down with your regular bullets. The game has a nice rotation effect, and the enemy sprites look like they're legitimately scaling. The frame rate is also excellent for a game like this. From a graphical standpoint, this game does remind me of Afterburner, which is a huge compliment. Unfortunately, this game is very repetitive and boring. I'm not sure how reliant this game is on the SuperGrafx's capabilities. This doesn't seem like a game where you need more than one background layer. This isn't terrible, but not one of the console's strongest games. Let's try Madou King Granzort. This is a surprisingly decent platformer. You start off with a sword, and you can collect upgrades that improve its power. You die in one hit, but you can collect the special suit that grants you a second hit. The graphics are nice and colorful, and there's lots of parallax scrolling in this game. The controls are great too. Your sword has a good range, and the jumping is nice and floaty like a Mario game. Some of the platforming is weird though. At some points, you're required to bounce off enemies to reach higher platforms, otherwise you're stuck. The game is also surprisingly difficult. You only have 3 lives, and you die in a single hit unless you have that special suit. There's also no continues, which I think is a bit harsh. There are secret areas that do give you a ton of free lives though. If you're looking for a more floaty platformer, you'll have a good time with this. I would take a look at more games, but that's all of them. I just covered the entire library of SuperGrafx games. Could you imagine buying this console and only being able to play 5 games on it? There wasn't much diversity in the genre of games either. There's 2 shooters, 2 platformers, and a flight simulator. I'm sure there would have been more genres if this console didn't fail so quickly though. The hardware was not much better than the PC Engine. Outside of parallax scrolling, I don't see much of a difference between SuperGrafx games and PC Engine ones. It's clear that NEC was desperate to include parallax scrolling just to beat Sega. It's never a great tactic to release a new console so quickly and not change much about it. Consumers should feel like they're getting their money's worth. That's not going to happen if you're releasing a new console only 2 years after the previous one. Nintendo always got this right. There was always plenty of time in between their consoles, and the newest release would always be significantly better than the last. Despite the lack of parallax scrolling, the PC Engine could have fought Sega on its own. Some of the later titles did look impressive, and they did pull off parallax scrolling in many games even if they used cheap tactics. Better graphics are not everything. Sega is a good example of this. Despite their consoles having better hardware, Nintendo would always end up being on top because of better games and better third-party support. The SuperGrafx would end up being a commercial failure and was never released outside of Japan. The PC Engine had some great hardware capabilities, especially against the NES, but when the Mega Drive came out, that made the console look very obsolete. The SuperGrafx was a desperate attempt to answer Sega, but unfortunately it did not have the intended results. Hey, I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, hit that like button. If you enjoy this type of content, hit the subscribe button for more content. Both of these things really help the channel grow. If you have anything to share, feel free to leave a comment. I read every single comment on this channel, and I'm pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one.